Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in from the United States and from around the world. I'm Charles Litchfield. I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center and the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow. We're very excited to have you here for a conversation on improving the enforcement of Russian sanctions. We're sadly coming up on the one-year anniversary of Russia's unjustified war on Ukraine. And today we have some very exciting guests to discuss all the aspects of enforcement. I should say that this event is being held, in cooperation with Castellum AI, a wonderful provider of compliance information on sanctions. Our global sanctions dashboard, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, relies on Castellum for some of its data. We then do some of the work on data visualization and analysis. So we're very, very proud to be able to welcome Castellum AI to an Atlantic Council event to discuss just how useful their tool is in finding some of the discrepancies in sanctions policy and trying to move forward with enforcement. I've been using the word enforcement a lot because 2023 is the year of enforcement. It's very important at this point that we start looking at where some of the evasion is going on and reacting to it. The number of sanctions packages, both in the EU and in the US, have now reached double digits. It's fine to add additional sanctions where appropriate, but our belief at the Geoeconomic Center, and I think this is widely shared in Washington and other capitals, is that we now need to look very closely at how sanctions are being applied and where there is potential evasion. So I'll stop here. I'm leaving you in the competent hands of Maya Nikoladze, who's the Associate Director for Economic Statecraft with me at the Geoeconomic Center, and she will introduce our excellent panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for your remarks, and thank you all for joining us today on this beautiful Monday morning to talk about Russia sanctions enforcement. Now, as Charles mentioned, in 2 weeks, it's going to be exactly 1 year since Russia's senseless and brutal invasion of Ukraine started, and also 1 year since the West imposed its unprecedented sanctions against Russia. As of today, there are more than 11,000 sanctions against Russian entities and individuals, and we saw Western sanctions programs expanded by 42% last year. On top of that, G7 allies also were creative with new economic measures, and they implemented the oil price cap, which basically intends to limit the price of Russian oil to $60. We could impose thousands of sanctions. However, it's not effective and they don't achieve objectives unless they are enforced. And that's why today we will talk about how well enforced sanctions are against Russia. What are the most common evasion techniques Russian entities and individuals use, and how could we improve enforcement moving forward? And that's why today we are also joined by a panel of experts on energy and sanctions. First, we have Daniel Tannenbaum, who is a partner at Oliver Wyman and also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. Next, we have Peter Piasecki, who is a CEO and a founder of Castellum AI. And last but not least, we have Ellen Walt, who is a president at Transversal Consulting and also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Now, before we get to it, I'd like to encourage our audience to submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Make them difficult, and we'll try to do our best to answer them. And with that, Dan, I'd like to start with you as a person who wears this badge of honor of actually being sanctioned by Russia. Now, every day you work with companies who have actually been withdrawing from Russia in 2022, and I can't help but notice, but there are some mixed reports about the number of Western companies actually leaving Russia or not. So what's your take on that? And also, working with these companies, what are the most common challenges they encounter while trying to exit the Russian market?
Thanks, Maya, and apologies for my voice. I'm still getting over my Eagles' loss last night in the Super Bowl. There was a report that came out in December that a lot of people saw that said that less than 9% of the companies that have announced an exit from Russia have actually exited Russia. Now, I think there's some questions around the methodology that's used and how true that 9% mark actually is. But I think the challenge remains. Russia has obviously made it since the earliest days of the sanctions in response to their invasion extremely difficult for Western businesses to exit, trying to challenge the ability for firms to divest, in some instances nationalizing businesses in advance of those divestments. I think one of the things that companies have had to balance is obviously to safeguard their human capital on the ground, moving expats, moving Russian nationals that wanted to work in other countries, but still continue working with those businesses. And I say this working in an organization that announced in one of the earlier waves an exit from Russia. My company, Oliver Wyman, our parent, Marsh McLennan, announced an exit rather early on, but a big focus of this was safeguarding our personnel above all else. Now, some of the other challenges when I work with firms who have tried to exit is making sure they're also managing the loss events that they may take. For some firms, they were facing nearly $10 billion losses as a result of their businesses in Russia. So trying to balance out all of those issues in terms of safeguarding personnel, making sure that you didn't have an undue burden economically on the overall business's health, that those were some of the challenges that we really saw firms grapple with. You saw some companies sell early to local partners. Others were still trying to find kind of reasonable deals. But I do think it's important, especially as we hit the 1 year mark on the 24th, that you have more attention for companies that have announced an exit that may have continued to be doing business in Russia, that haven't necessarily made those measures as aggressively as you would have hoped to make good on some of those promises, or better yet, the companies that have been silent and might have still been providing business into Russia. And obviously, those have been some of the challenges that we've seen companies need to balance as they look at what does life look like going forward.
Thank you, Dan. And Peter, next, I'd like to ask you about the discrepancies in Western jurisdiction sanctions against Russia. Now, we've been working together throughout this crazy year of sanctions in 2022 on the Global Sanctions Dashboard. And when we look at the data, we notice that the United States is way ahead in terms of number of entities and individuals who are sanctioned, ahead of other Western jurisdictions. Now, could you explain what is causing this discrepancy in sanctioning? And also, do these discrepancies make it easier for Russia to evade or circumvent sanctions?
Excellent question, Maya, and I'll answer that in two parts. So the first is, why has the U.S. placed more sanctions and more different types of sanctions on Russia? And I think the answer comes down to the U.S. has the most experience in placing sanctions. The U.S. has also the most experienced sanctions bureaucracy, the largest and most well-funded sanctions bureaucracy and organization, that being OFAC, and also the one that gets the most support from the rest of the national security apparatus. So Canada or the UK or Japan or your various European countries, they don't have the same type of close relationship. Their sanctioning bodies don't have the same type of close relationship with their security services that Treasury has. So the US is quite simply better resourced, more experienced, and more able to place sanctions. And also because the decision-making is done entirely within the US for the most part, able to act a lot quicker. So the US leads, and I think what you've seen in different administrations is Obama really wanted to have sanctions go along with European partners. For Trump, that was not a consideration at all. Sometimes that was even an anti-consideration. Under the Biden administration, we're a lot closer to Obama's approach of multilateralism, but Biden still wants to work very closely with Europe, and that definitely makes sense for the Russia sanctions because Europe is the one that's going to be fairly effective. So I think for the why does the U.S. lead, I don't see this as a, or why has the U.S. done more? I don't see this as a because don't want to do enough. Sorry, I hit my camera cord. It's not because Europe and Japan or UK don't want to do more. It's simply they have less resources. And oftentimes when the U.S. puts sanctions forward, information gets declassified, press releases get put out, that information that gets shared with our partners. So that's why you'll see U.S. sanction someone first, and then European partners follow on. And then a lot of times, in the press they'll read like, oh, Europe is having such a difficult time putting forward sanctions. I always think that's really kind of missing the point. Like you have 27 countries that are actually all agreeing on punitive economic policy that impacts literally the ability of their residents to keep their homes. So they're making very, very difficult decisions. And it's it's not easy to agree on those decisions. It's not easy when you have to make those decisions in one capital, not to mention 27. So EU is always going to come at this a bit slower. But overall, this is, not even overall, by far the most coordinated global sanctions program ever. And then to the second part of your question, will this make it easier for Russia to evade sanctions? The gaps certainly create opportunity, but I think it's not something that is significant, and it's not something that would worry me if I was in the Treasury Department, because if something is on either the US or EU sanctions list, the big three are really US, EU, UN. And UN doesn't participate in this for obvious reasons. But if something's on the EU, US, or EU list, no sensible bank is going to touch anyone on those lists. So as long as someone is listed on one, a bank or a financial institution or corporate that has a strong risk committee will not do business with them. There's obvious exceptions to this, like Nord Stream, but I think what we're really looking at is, countries in Asia where they might say, we're just going to ignore this.
Thank you, Peter. And actually, everyone watching us right now can go to Atlantic Council's Russia sanctions database and take a look at those gaps themselves using our interactive visualization tools. Now, I'd like to ask you a question, Ellen. So the oil price cap was implemented in December, and for a while, not too many people even understood how it was going to work. Then it was imposed, and the price of oil has been remaining below $60, but still there are questions around it. So could you actually walk us through how the oil price cap works, and then who do you think have been the winners and the losers since it went into effect?
Sure. So you can definitely count me as one of those people who was rather skeptical and not really sure about how this oil price cap was going to work. And I'm honestly still wondering how the enforcement, or at least how they plan to enforce this. I think that they're basically limited to enforcing it against any Western companies that are facilitating any kind of transport of Russian oil. But let me kind of take a step back and then explain. So the price cap that was instituted in December basically applies to crude oil, and that was set at $60 a barrel. And actually at the time, Russian blends of crude oil, there are all sorts of various different blends of crude oil on the market, and then we kind of base that off of benchmarks. So there's the Brent benchmark, there's the WTI benchmark. Those are the two big ones. WTI is used in the United States, and Brent is the international one. So what they were doing was they were setting the price cap for Russian oil. Russia primarily exports two blends. Urals blend is its main exported blend, and that is a heavy sour or a medium heavy sour blend. And then there's also a lighter oil that it also exports, but doesn't produce as much of that blend. And so at the time that the price cap was set, Russian oil was actually traded, or at least the Urals blend was trading below $60 a barrel. So it basically didn't matter whether anyone was buying Russian oil using any kind of Western insurance or Western trading companies or Western ships, because it was all trading for under $60 a barrel. The price cap that was instituted in February applies to refined petroleum products like diesel, heating oil, gasoline, for example. And so that was set at $100 a barrel for products that traded a premium to crude, so products that cost more per barrel than crude oil. Mostly in this case, we're talking about diesel. And then $45 a barrel for products that traded a discount to crude oil. We're talking mostly fuel oil and naphtha. And so that just went into effect, I think last week or maybe the week before. And both price caps, the goal is to prohibit Western insurance, shipping, and other companies from financing, insuring, trading, brokering, or carrying cargoes of Russian crude and crude oil products. Now, remember, this only applies to seaborne products. So anything that goes through a pipeline is not affected. And also remember that Europe and the United States already have sanctions on this. So this applies to oil and oil products that are going to countries like between, say, Russia and Turkey, or Russia and Indonesia, Russia, China, Russia, India. There are no products going between Russia and Germany or Russia and the United States, because those are mostly under sanctions, at least seaborne. And so basically the bigger issue, I think, for Western companies was really mostly the sanctions. In terms of how people have been affected, I would say that in terms of the United States, the US doesn't really import very much crude oil from Russia at all. The only area that really imported any kind of significant amounts of Russian oil products were the northeastern United States. And that they've run into some issues there. Basically, they have always had a robust trade across the Atlantic, especially for diesel, but other products as well. They've even imported Russian diesel at times. But now what's happening is that European countries that used to export their diesel to, say, the US are not doing that anymore. And so there's been diesel shortages actually in the northeastern United States, because not because we don't have enough diesel fuel in the United States, but because it's very difficult to get diesel fuel that's produced in, say, the Gulf or areas where there are a lot of refineries to the northeastern US. We don't have enough pipeline capacity, essentially. And things like the Jones Act make it very difficult to ship US produced diesel, say, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Northeast, to ports in the Northeast, because the Jones Act means you have to use only American made and American owned ships to do that. And so that's why we've seen some issues with diesel. And I think we're going to see these issues become more pronounced as we get into the summer months. The losers, I would say, are Europe and the United States, who've had some issues getting products. Winners in this case are definitely Asian refineries, because they are buying lots of discounted Russian crude oil, and they have the potential now to refine that into products that they can then sell back to Europe and the United States, because Europe and the United States won't buy directly from Russia. But the way this goes is they're happy to kind of buy products that have then been refined in other countries, even if they use Russian crude oil. This is apparently totally acceptable under the sanctions and the price cap policy. So one of the effects for Russia, though, has been that a lot of Russia's oil exports have become less diversified. If you looked at those charts that were just displayed, you can see Russia's total customer base before the sanctions and the price cap was very, very diversified. They were sending oil all over the place. Now they're much more, they're much less diversified, and they have many fewer customers. They've opened up a totally new market in India, which is a huge thing for Russia and also for India, because India is a growing, has incredible potential for growth. So there's a lot of room there for Russia to really solidify this new market and sell India the products and also the crude oil it needs at low prices. India really, really cannot afford to buy crude oil at $100 a barrel. So if they can get it for less, if they can keep it under $60 a barrel, India will be thrilled. But on the other hand, that does leave Russia very much at the mercy of its primary customers, China and India, who are really going to push to keep prices down. They're not going to want to pay over a certain amount for Russian crude, especially as we see the price of Brent get higher. So it's really kind of created, I would say, a lot of distortions in the market, and very interesting, though, for those of us who watch markets and watch prices to see how this customer and supplier relationship plays out.
Thank you, Ellen. And you mentioned West and or the US and EU being sort of the losers in this scenario. And I actually want to ask about Western companies. What are the new hurdles that the oil price cap has created for them?
Well, this was actually obviously very well telegraphed in advance of the price caps going into effect. And the guidance put out by OFAC, put out by OFSI in the UK, was actually quite good to help firms understand their role in the ecosystem from a transactional standpoint, but also give clarity on kind of how much diligence is enough. So thinking about the banks that are financing the movement of oil, thinking about the insurers that are insuring the hulls of the tankers that are moving the oil, there was quite a bit of clarity actually in how the guidance was put forth for companies to deploy from a compliance standpoint. Now, some companies in the financial services side, non-exclusive of insurance, just decided not to have any part in financing Russian oil at all anymore, that went beyond their risk appetite. For those that continue, there's essentially a safe harbor embedded within this program where, so long as you can evidence that you've attempted to follow the guidance within this price cap structure of how to ensure that the movement, the oil was actually purchased at or below the price cap was done, then you're largely safe from an enforcement standpoint. And that was made clear, and actually obviously a help to a lot of sectors, depending on their role in this. But I think the hurdles had really been, one, up until that guidance came out, how do we actually implement this? And that was a huge concern of, well, how, if we're a bank that's participating in a letter of credit for the movement of Russian oil, what is enough evidence to confirm that we can ensure that the oil was purchased at or below the price cap? And so I think as that guidance flushed out, I hear less and less concern from firms that are involved in either the insurance or the financing of these movements. Some of this is now becoming a question of, even though it's legal, is this in the right risk appetite that we want to keep? And it is a good reminder, obviously. I mean, Russia is not the most sanctioned country in the world, not by a country mile. When you divorce the amount of designations that have been put forth over the last year, which obviously have been extreme, with a 42% increase in the watch lists in 2022, there's still a lot of sectors where there's permissible trade. And so when you begin to look and talk about evasion, this isn't even evasion. This is still legal commerce that may be permitted. And that is the question when you begin to look across the different sanctions programs of how much commerce do we want the West to have with Russia across the board?
Thank you, Dan. And I actually have a question now. If we will move on to the evasion techniques used by Russian entities and individuals. Peter, I want to ask you first, and then what are the most common evasion techniques? What are some of the flags we should look out for?
I was also going to say, I want to disagree with Dan, but Dan's right. And this is kind of a different way of like looking at the data. Like Russia is by far the most sanctioned if we're looking numerically. And there's different ways to kind of rack it and stack it, but there's Iran and North Korea are subject to so many different sectoral sanctions, which are essentially we ban business with an entire sector of the economy, and then it's up to U.S. and European and other businesses to figure out which companies, which could be in the thousands, are in that sector. So yeah, kind of to Dan's point. The U.S. and Europe have not said we want to cut off all business with Russia. So it's and to tie into your question, I also just want to say, Dan, Ellen, please interrupt me any time if anything I say that you disagree with, which I'm sure.
And look, you and I have had this debate for the last year, so this is an important topic though to raise, because there have been a ton of designations, but there's still a lot of legal commerce that's not restricted, and that's not getting as much play.
Yeah, and yes, and energy is of course the big one. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know what are the other major sectors where a lot of activity is going, but in terms of just straight up evasion, and I think we flagged this a while ago, but the Central Asian states and especially Kazakhstan have become like a major point for transshipment. I was looking at some data recently that said Kazakhstan's sale, I don't know why they publish this information, but it's like government customs records. Kazakhstan is selling something like 18 times more microchips and cell phone parts to Russia than they did at the same point last year. There is only one explanation for that, which is that supplies that would have previously gone to Russia that cannot do the sanctions are now going to Kazakhstan, where they're being packaged and resold. And so we've seen this exact type of pattern with Iran and the UAE. You have a lot of Iranian businesses, a lot of Iranian nationals that live in the UAE, and for decades now they have done good business by basically buying things that you can't buy to Iran, but you can buy to the UAE, and then reselling them. So I think the number one type of evasion is just going to be reselling and reshipping in destinations where you have specifically a land border, because it's a lot easier to evade scrutiny when you don't have to put things on a plane again. And then, I mean, the other part is kind of examining, from what we've seen from our clients and users globally is, and Ellen highlighted this regarding India, like a lot of organizations in Asia are breaking US and EU sanctions. They're violating them. And the question is simply, what is going to be the US and EU enforcement posture? And then also, what kind of political will did it have? Because, we all know what's happening in Turkey and India. But in the US even took the unusual step of sending several letters to Turkey's Chamber of Commerce saying, hey, we're watching you. And so you probably have this conversation going on between Treasury and State, where Treasury is like, we see sanctions violations in Turkey regarding Russia. We want to crack down. And State will say, no, we need Erdogan to be supportive of us. If we sanction Turkish companies, Erdogan might not let Finland and Sweden into NATO. So just to kind of very quickly sum that up, I think a lot of the evasion is going to simply go through reshipping. And then it's a question of political and enforcement will.
Yeah, and just to quickly tag on to that, an evasion kind of assumes that the conduct is illegal. And again, to the prior point, there's a lot that hasn't been banned through sanctions. To Pete's point, you've seen a heavy focus on trade shift to India, China, the UAE, Turkey over the last year. Even just last week, the central bank of the UAE gave a license to a Russian bank to open up shop in Dubai to help facilitate transactions between Russia and the UAE. You don't have to look very far to follow the money to see realistically where activity is going to potential allies of the West. Now, and again, this might not be legal, but illegal, but this goes back to the question of how much latitude are we going to allow these allies to continue and support trade that's probably not on the right side of the Western objectives related to Russia, but at the same time might not be totally illegal. So that is the calculus as you look into 2023, not saying that all of that type of trade outflows to those countries is essentially evasion, but some of it certainly is. But how much latitude are we going to continue to give allies to the Western coalition in terms of support? I mean, South Africa, for instance, is about to host joint military exercises with Russia and China. And I know the Treasury Department has continued to remind the South African government that sanctions circumvention met with a response, as it has historically. But again, all we're doing is threatening at this point. We haven't made good from an enforcement standpoint over the last year. And while cases at a company by company level, as Pete and I know, take a long time to really be brought, there's still more restrictions that could be placed on countries or companies or even broader public awareness that some of this activity is continuing.
Sorry, Dan, I want to jump in and be rude and throw something back to you regarding the enforcement, which is, I've been expecting more large fines, and there haven't been. And I've been essentially wrestling with the question, is it because large corporates and financial institutions have actually stopped doing business with Russia, or we don't have eyes on places where this is ongoing, or is it like a lack of enforcement?
I'll do you one better. There's some European countries that don't even have the legal right to enforce sanctions. So while they're subject to the sanctions by the bloc, they don't have the ability to actually enforce them. So there's some legislative hurdles that countries are working through now, which just sounds silly when you say that out loud, but it's all part of that same problem.
All right, so we heard all these activities on the invasion on sort of entities and individuals front. So it's not unreasonable to think that Russia would also try to undermine the oil price cap. And Ellen, one of the ways Russia could do that is building up its own fleet of tankers, then do domestic insurance, and that way evade the oil price cap. How realistic is that Russia would actually be able to do it, and how long would it take?
So one of the things I also just want to point out with regards to the previous discussion, specifically regarding oil, because I'm not really up on sanctions on other things, but my understanding of this entire policy was that the goal was actually to keep Russian oil on the market, just to limit Russia's ability to bring in revenue, just to limit the revenue that Russia's getting from oil. So they don't actually want that oil off the market. They want people buying that oil. They want them to be, refining it into diesel and selling it. And it's totally fine if for Europe to buy, for European countries to buy, diesel from wherever that's been made from Russian crude, as long as they're not paying Russia directly. At least that's my understanding of how this policy works. So that kind of goes into the second question of, well, is this policy actually limiting Russia's ability to, Russia's revenue? Is the price cap set too high? And that was the argument of a bunch of European countries, especially the ones that are closest to Russia. They're saying, you put the price cap at $60 a barrel, this is back in December, they're saying, well, what's the point? You're not limiting very much of anything because they're already selling their oil for $60 or less. So, you're not really doing that much. And I think that they have a very good point. And that what we have seen over the past year, because there's been a lot of, time to kind of prepare for this, is that while, yes, the best insurance and the best shipping and the best trading companies are Western, they're not the only ones out there. And that if you want to get oil from point A to point B, there are other ways to do this. And I think that Iran was really kind of a pioneer in this, and that now Russia has kind of adopted a lot of the things that Iran has done. They have Iran, kind of created, or not created, but kind of shored up its own tanker fleet. Russia is doing the same thing. Yes, you can't expect Russia to suddenly, create a huge, tanker fleet overnight. That's definitely not going to happen. It does take time. But one of the things that you have to understand is that the price cap is incentivized Russia to expand its tanker fleet. Like I said, you're not just going to suddenly come into possession of lots of Suezmax and VLCCs, but you can, build that over time. And there are lots of old ships out there for Russia to buy, especially if you don't really care that much about the condition of the ship. And I think the price cap policy encourages Russia to use older ships that aren't in as good condition for longer than they might be considered seaworthy. Remember, who's buying this oil? They may not be so concerned about the safety and issues like that. And I think that the longer the sanctions and the price cap policy remain in place, the greater Russia's incentive is to put real money into enlarging its fleet in a more permanent way. So the more time they have, the more realistic it becomes for Russia to basically be able to ship its oil using Russian tankers. And remember, India can also buy oil using Indian tankers, Indian-owned tankers, and Indian insurance. And there's a lot of incentive to also self-insure and to do trading, that's not done through Western firms. And so we're seeing this emerge. And I do think that, it's not, like I said, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's already emerging. And the longer this policy goes on, the more Russia is going to create its own independent fleet. And it becomes more realistic that Russia will be able to just completely evade this price cap by, self-insuring, self-shipping, all of these things. At the same time, its customer base, like I said, is now limited, which means that its customers have a greater say in the price. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia will get higher price for its oil. Urals blend may never trade, as high as it used to. It may always trade lower, as long as this policy is in place. But one of the things that's come out recently is that Russia's making a whole lot of money off of all these other services that it's now selling. So when you're looking at the amount of revenue that's been limited because of the sale of oil, you have to also take into account that they're now supplying all of these other services and they're making money off of that. And so that's something that has to be considered when you're, I think, looking at the policy in a holistic sense of, is this accomplishing the goals that it has been set out to accomplish? And is it doing what we want it to do? And hopefully the policymakers who have put this into place are evaluating this at various intervals and assessing whether this policy that is really distorting the market is actually having the intended effects and going the way it's supposed to go.
Thank you, Ellen. And I'll ask you one more follow-up question about the changes in energy markets since in 2022. So you already talked about how China and India have become Russia's number one or two destinations, and how their exports have become less diversified. What about European markets? Who replaced Russia in the European energy markets?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so far, I think a lot of people hope that the US is going to suddenly step up and become a huge supplier. But what we've seen is really that it's shifted to the Middle East. And we're seeing Saudi Arabia and Iraq become bigger suppliers for this area.
Thank you. And so, Peter, to that point, let's talk about Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is another very heavily sanctioned country that happens to have the world's largest proven oil reserves. Is there any chance that we will see sanctions against Venezuela being lifted? Because just recently, the Treasury just gave them licenses to continue oil shipments to Texas. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, before I just wanted to respond to a couple of points that Ellen made. I'm not smart enough to argue with Ellen. I don't have nearly enough expertise. But one thing I would say that's just interesting is like the Inflation Reduction Act has U.S. legislation has over about $500 billion in eco-friendly tax credits that are meant to promote green energy. And so, like, to Ellen's exactly right. Like, Russia has other places it can send its oil, but there is kind of the question of what if the U.S. is able to sustain its role now as a large exporter to Europe and others, and because Russia's such a big country, sanctions, of course, cannot sanctions alone will not change the will of Russian leadership. It's a dictatorship run by criminals, and they have shown that they don't care about their own people or the value of human life. So like, it takes a lot more than sanctions to change that. But you can successfully do things like say, hey, we as a market are going to minimize our exposure to you, and we're going to move away from our long-term reliance. And I mean, that goes right into the Venezuela question, because the human rights situation in Venezuela has not improved. Maduro has not suddenly become better. The treatment of the opposition there has not improved. So why is the U.S. government looking at licensing more activity? It's precisely because we're looking at how do we reduce the world's reliance on Russian oil. So it's very much a lesser evil kind of situation. Venezuela is easily and inarguably a lesser evil than Russia. And so if we're looking at, okay, we want more energy flooding the world markets, what's, probably meeting somewhere in the White House and like, hey, we want more energy. We don't want to have gas and oil prices shoot up. What can we do? And somebody probably said, hey, what if we let Venezuela export more oil? So my guess would be that there's going to be continual loosening of those restrictions. If I was somewhere in Venezuelan leadership, I would say, hey, maybe we can stop being terrible. I don't know if, they have meetings like that, but it would be in their best interests to, stop violating people's human rights as much as they do, to become slightly less repressive. They have very clear economic levers that are being shifted to them right now. If they allow more free press and more, they are going to get more levers. And sorry, just to throw some quick data points out there. you have 6 authorities that have Venezuela-focused sanctions: Canada, EU, France, Switzerland, UK, and US. So it's not just a US issue, but 59% of all the sanctions are US based. And the sanctions also cover vessels and aircraft as well, Venezuelan vessels and aircraft, which are used to transport things. So I think the sanctions on individuals, those are always the hardest to lift. For example, there's a Venezuelan, I think, vice president who's involved in narco trafficking and had ties to Hezbollah, but he's probably never coming off. But things like the Venezuelan central bank, that could come off early.
All right, Ellen, so even if all these sanctions were lifted against Venezuela, right, would they be able to start producing and exporting right away, or how does their production capacity look like?
So I'm just going to be really, really blunt about this. But if people in the State Department or wherever are thinking that loosening the sanctions against Venezuela is going to help with the oil supply problem, then they have no understanding of what has happened to the Venezuelan oil industry over the past, almost 10 years. And essentially, Venezuela's oil industry is in shambles. They may have technically the largest proven oil resources in the world, but they are not very easy to produce. One of the things you have to understand about Venezuelan oil is comparable to, say, Canadian tar sands oil. It's the oil they're producing right now is very sludgy and very thick, and you have to run it through these processes that basically adds things called diluents to it just to get it to flow through a pipeline. So they're called upgraders. And all of these upgraders are basically completely in disrepair. The Venezuelan oil industry will require so much investment, so much money, and so much outside expertise. I mean, it's just the personnel that have left. I mean, it's not just the physical plants and things, it's also the personnel, the oil industry itself. The company it's in so much disrepair that the amount of money and time and effort that would take it to get back on track, even to be exporting, say, above 2 million barrels a day, is so much that I would say it's not really worth it, just from an investment standpoint. And just knowing what we all know about Venezuela, you're not going to get private money that wants to go in there, especially with the current leadership. I mean, maybe if they have some sort of massive revolution and everyone is out and there's some sort of new
Ellen,
government.
I was just going to say, I was never at State Department, but to put on my State Department hat for a moment, I would say those all sound like technical difficulties, and someone in the private sector will do it. And it's kind of like, are we going to have, Russia's going to be basically a rogue state that's damaging to the world peace and prosperity for much longer than however long it takes.
I'm going to tell you that the people who are most interested in investing in Venezuelan oil are Russians, are Rosneft.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get if you can't get people to invest in producing oil in the United States, in American oil, where we have a stable government with regulations that are known and anti-bribery laws and things where it's going to happen, you're not going to get them to suddenly pour money into the Venezuelan oil industry that's never going to be able to put the amount of oil on the market that Russia has. Combined with the fact that it's not the same type of oil. It's not quite the same type grade, so it can't just totally replace it. When we're looking at what happened with the United States, where they gave this license to Chevron to export some oil to the U.S., that was done much more. I mean, that was basically done because Chevron lobbied very, very hard because they lost a huge amount of money in Venezuela. They lost a lot of business. They lost a lot of money, and they lobbied very hard to get this so that they can try to recoup some of their losses because of these sanctions. This oil is not going to actually be able to replace Russian oil in the market. I really don't see, the State Department can say, well, it's just technical things, but who are you actually going to convince to invest in Venezuelan oil when, there could be sanctions and you'll end up like Chevron in a terrible situation. Plus, you've got to it's just so much. I can't even explain the amount of disrepair that the Venezuelan oil industry is in that it would take. It's not a serious, you do better to invest in American oil production, and higher exports there with all of the hurdles that we currently have. I think that would be a much more likely area, or invest in Guyana. I mean, there are a lot of other places where we can produce more oil to say to try to displace Russian oil in the market, I'd say Venezuela would be like one of the last ones on my list.
Looks like we have some strong feelings about Venezuela. And
I'll just say, Ellen, you and I should make an offline bet saying that by the end of 2023, I will say there will be over 5 million in new investment in Venezuelan oil or energy.
$1 million is nothing. $5 million is pennies for what you need.
I understand, but I would
it's not going to do.
I think there will be some investment.
It's not going to help combat Russian. I mean, it's worth. I mean, it's basically worthless. New investment. I mean, it's not going to bring that oil to market. It's not the type of oil that's needed.
What's a number that we should put a bet on? 100 million.
I'm not going to bet on a number because anyone investing in Venezuelan oil, unless they've got some kind of guarantee from the U.S. government, I think should probably be fired as CEO of their company by the board.
Yeah.
So that'll be.
Well, luckily, I don't invest in oil.
That'll be an interesting development to watch out for. But before that, Dan, so we actually have some questions from the audience. Maria Demertzis, hi Maria, is asking about the value of further sanctions. Is it worth the effort, in particular, to sort of impose sanctions since the enforcement is so difficult? What would you say to that, Dan?
So it's interesting when I talk to clients around Europe, again, because of the fact that this is a heavily list-based driven program with some other challenges like some of the investment bans and securities bans, it would be easier from a risk management standpoint if there were more sectoral bans across a host of different sectors. So for one, there's certainly an ease of actually implementing the regime more broadly. I think one of the other challenges, though, that also exists is, the whole goal is to increase the pressure on Russia to force a change in behavior. And obviously, as most of us know, sanctions and isolation are not going to drive Russia out of Ukraine. However, you want to continue to isolate Russia. So where there's sectors for rare earth minerals and other commodities that are continuing to be purchased, is that something that we really want? And Ellen's spot on. I mean, the Russian oil sanctions were not designed to completely eliminate Russian oil from the market. They were designed to limit the profit that Russia can actually derive from this. But how many other sectors? I know there were restrictions on timber at one point last year. How many other sectors do we want them to continue to profit from without curbs? And I do think, it does send a message when you look at trade data, and the New York Times published a report in October that showed in some EU nations trade increased over the course of 2022 with Russia. So those don't send very powerful messages, certainly not to the people of Ukraine, but it is kind of a question of how much inclusion in the global economy do we really want to allow Russia to have, absent a few specific areas where we know we need to continue to purchase items from them?
So thank you, Peter. And there is actually another question from the audience. So David Santiago is asking whether crypto Ethereum can be used for sanctions evasion. And I also like to ask the same question to Peter after Dan.
So there's been a whole fuss of crypto and its use in circumventing sanctions since the very beginning. We've seen reports in front of Congress from companies like Chainalysis that have not really evidenced that movement of mass circumvention using digital assets. Interestingly, a lot of the larger digital assets players have begun weighing bans on allowing Russian nationals to transact at all on their exchanges and platforms. So, can they be enforced? The regulated crypto businesses have to have financial crime controls, just like traditional banks. So they're still on the hook to monitor for some of this activity. And again, even if you're outside of that traditional financial regulated environment, you're still looking at those inflows of where could there be an opportunity for some of those exchanges to move kind of dirty money into good firms. And that's the main obligation of anyone that's dealing in crypto or fiat, to monitor for suspicious activity. So, I mean, I don't think we're seeing any data that evidences that crypto is being used at scale to circumvent sanctions. I think also, if you look at the valuation of some of these digital assets, that doesn't seem like the greatest idea to try and manage with such a wild fluctuation in the values of some of these currencies as well. You can end up losing more potentially. I don't know.
I want to jump in. No, Dan is spot on, and I would encourage everyone that thinks about this to put themselves in a very product manager role of like a terrorist organization or someone evading sanctions. Like, you have a job, and you have a boss, whether you're a terrorist organization or someone sitting in Moscow, and you're tasked with like, hey, I need you to buy these microchips, or I need you to buy these guns, and you're like, hey, let's try crypto. Like, if you would try to walk through that process of how you're going to use crypto to buy weapons or to get microchips, you actually can't effectively do it. Like, to put money into the crypto ecosystem, to then make purchases, like which gun manufacturer or which chips manufacturer is going to accept crypto payments from an anonymous account? That is not going to happen. So this is just one. It's always, whenever people talk about sanctions evasion, I always encourage them to put yourself in the shoes of the sanctions evader and actually walk step by step of how you're going to do this. And most of the time you'll find that the traditional banking system or cash is the best way to evade sanctions. But one thing which I do want to highlight, I think is a very serious risk related to crypto and Russia, is if Russia turns to North Korean style tactics. North Korea has been extraordinarily effective and has become arguably the largest threat to the entire crypto ecosystem, maybe after fraud or even ahead of fraud, because they're not looking at it as a way of conducting trade or buying assets. They're just looking at it as a heist. North Korea has incredibly talented cyber warriors, and they routinely hack into large exchanges, small exchanges, new projects. They steal crypto. Of course, Dan's point here is really important about you want to know the volatility. But if you're stealing, 100 million worth of a coin, it drops in half value before you cash out, you still made a $50 million profit. So Russia is incredibly adept at ransomware. One of the most interesting, we have a lot of cybersecurity clients. One of the most interesting things I heard from them was that at the beginning of the war, they actually saw a very serious drop in ransomware activity because a lot of the people engaged in ransomware activity had been drafted on both sides of the war. Because both Ukraine and Russia, you got a lot of people there that were engaged in ransomware. So something to watch out for, Russia taking on North Korean tactics.
Thank you, Peter. And we'll take one last question from the audience. And Ellen, this one's going to be for you. Peter Ullman is asking, how do we monitor the shadow fleets that transport Russian crude oil products?
So that's a great question, and one of the ways that people do this is there are a variety of different companies out there that basically track tankers. So they use satellites, and they use information from satellites. They do it visually. There are a lot of different firms that do that. I happen to use one called Tanker Trackers. I think they have a lot of very in-depth knowledge of various ships. They really go into a lot of depth in terms of analyzing the ships, and they know where they're going, and they can track them. They've done a lot of really good work identifying Iranian oil, and so that's the same way they do it for Russian oil. They can basically follow a ship from where it leaves. A lot of these ships will kind of like spoof they'll turn off their AIS transponders, so it's not clear necessarily where they're going. You have to track them visually, or they'll say they're going to one place and really they're not. A lot of times when ships say that they're going to Malaysia, they're actually they list, oh, we're delivering oil to Malaysia. They're actually, or they say they're Malaysian oil going to China. They're actually Iranian oil going to China through Malaysia. So and you can actually watch when they do the ship-to-ship transfers, and that's how you know that oil is being offloaded from one ship onto another, and then it's going somewhere else. And so there are a variety of companies that do this, and that's basically how we keep track of it.
Thank you, Ellen. And we actually have just 5 minutes left. Perfect timing for some closing remarks. For if you want to talk about how could we improve enforcement moving forward. And let's go, Dan, Peter, Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's still other levers that are out there. We hadn't really gotten into secondary sanctions, but secondary sanctions are kind of often threatened and seldom used. And they were fantastically effective in forcing a wide swath of humanity to choose between Iran and the Western coalition. In this instance, it's a little more difficult since you still have some countries as part of that coalition that need to purchase certain things from Russia. So the last thing you want to do is impose secondary sanctions that impose harm on your allies as part of this process. But I think realistically, we need more public naming and shaming of material businesses that are known to be doing things that really run contrary to the objectives of the Western coalition related to responding to the actions in Ukraine. We've seen some reports outing companies that are continuing to transact with parts of Russian businesses that are probably on the line of legal. Enforcement takes time to build cases, but we just need to see more in terms of where is this not going right? Where are people evading sanctions? Also, to help the people that are trying to do the right thing realize that they may not be doing the wrong thing as it relates to how they're trying to comply with a fairly complicated program as well.
Peter?
Fines. There need to be fines. Like, I am not, like, you know, we're a global startup with very limited resources, and I am aware of sanctions violations in multiple countries, just by people reaching out and saying, like, hey, I think I'm violating sanctions. So I think that the US government, with all of its resources, has to be aware of entities and individuals, especially in the Middle East and Asia, violating Russia sanctions. And I think you really have to start kind of putting the enforcement hammer down, and a lot, just more fines.
All right, Ellen?
So I would say that, as we talked about, Russia is still making money from oil revenue, and it kind of goes back and forth whether they think, oh, these sanctions are really hurting Putin. Oh, no, they're not really actually hurting Putin all that much. And I think that the nations that are imposing these, particularly the price caps, but also the sanctions, should really consider what the end game is here and what purpose these policies are supposed to serve, and have actual benchmarks to evaluate their effectiveness. Before the price cap policy was implemented, when it was being conceived, I remember having a conversation with someone in the Biden administration. I said, so what's the point? And it was kind of described as hurt Putin. Well, that's not a policy goal. I think they really should have a set of ideas of what they actually hope this price cap is going to achieve, how to measure it, and when they're planning on unwinding this policy, because it is putting a lot of extra weight on the market. And it's not just Russian oil, but on the entire global market, especially at a time when supply is going to get tight. Yes, we hear right now, okay, the market is balanced. The UAE oil minister said that today, the market is balanced. Well, it's not always going to be this way. We don't have any more releases from the SPR. The US cannot continue to release its entire SPR just to kind of paper over holes in the oil market. If Russia wants to cut its production, that's its prerogative. US oil production is not going to increase that much more under these circumstances. And I think that officials really need to take a holistic view of what is this policy doing? What is it hoping to achieve? What other policies do we have in place now that are hurting ourselves in combination with hurting us from this price cap policy? And what's the goal here in terms of how do we want Putin to react? Are you looking to use this to compel him to say withdraw from Ukraine, to sue for peace? I don't know, but it just seems that these goals have not been articulated. And so I think that the longer this policy goes on, the more these goals need to be at least articulated to the public, and because otherwise it just feels like they're distorting the market for really no good reason.
Thank you, Ellen. And this brings us to the inevitable conclusion of this event. As I already said at the beginning, in around 2 weeks, it's going to be exactly 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. And as long as the war continues, sanctioning will also continue. And we will be working very hard to make sure you are updated about what sanctions are in place, what effects they are having, and how is the Russian economy performing. In fact, in 2 weeks, we will also be updating Atlantic Council's Russia sanctions database to include analysis on the enforcement and also the Russian economy. Finally, I'd like to thank Dan, Peter, and Ellen for sharing their insights from working on these issues and topics every day. And I'd also like to thank Atlantic Council's events and audiovisual team who made this event possible. Also my team led by Josh Lipsky, the Senior Director of the Geoeconomic Center, and Charles Litchfield, the Deputy Director you met just at the beginning of this event and with whom I had a pleasure of working this entire year on economic statecraft. Finally, have a nice week to all of you and stay tuned for our work on sanctions and economic statecraft.